Hello, my name is Mary McKeel, and I am the Standards Consultant for the American Academy of Forensic Sciences Academy Standards Board, ASB. And I am delighted to introduce you to the new 2021 Reference Manual and Style Guide. This is the first of a series of training modules intended to help you, as our consensus body document writers, as well as the public, to understand what ASB offers and what our documents look like and the purpose of each one. Following this pre-recorded presentation, there will be a live Zoom so you can ask questions and give us some feedback. Joining me will be two people I know you know very well, Teresa Ambrosius, the ASB Secretariat, and Linda Wilson, the ASB Technical Manager. So, welcome to the first training module, which presents an overview of the manual and of the new supplemental guide. In this module, you'll find basic introduction to the manual, focus on the document deliverables and select document elements, the purpose and content of the new supplemental guide, a summary of the major changes from the 2018 version, and online only, we're putting a self-study quiz for your enjoyment, really. Take it anytime you want and as many times as you want. There's no quiz involved. What you'll learn here in this module will be the ASB document types, the purpose of each, and the differences among them. One of the key elements of this session is to introduce you to the newest ASB deliverable, the GUIDELINE document, and why ASB has decided to introduce this one to the family of deliverables. The expanded Annex section provides additional insight and information on areas such as references, normative versus informative, and scope writing, to name a few. This module also presents the new supplemental guide. Finally, you'll learn about up-and-coming video modular training. This is what the new document and guideline look like, and I think by now most of you have seen this and have copies of them. Please note the new ASB logo. We're pretty proud of it. Before getting started into the context of the new manual, this slide gives a brief historical background for why ASB has issued a 2021 version. The first edition naturally focused primarily on how to format an ASB document, what an ASB document looks like. Very little was included in terms of assistance. In the 2018 edition, we provided more clarification on select elements, such as shall versus should, and contained a few topical examples. However, as you, our ASB volunteers, have produced more and more documents, you have more and more questions about content, about expressions of content, formatting, and the use of annexes. So ASB staff decided to respond by creating this 2021 version that provides clearer directions and more examples intended to help you as you do your job for ASB. That said, we as staff are always ready to hear your comments and questions and help in any way that we can. The 2021 manual has three main divisions as shown. Part 1 focuses on the types of documents available. This is where you'll find a description of the new guideline deliverable, as well as clearer explanation of standard, best practice recommendations, and technical report. Part 1 also includes common and less common components of documents. Part 2 is probably more familiar to you because it describes how ASB documents are formatted in terms of divisions and subdivisions. That said, there are some new directions for elements including the foreword and the scope. A major addition to the 2021 manual is the inclusion of more annexes to help as references for you CB writers. ASB staff also considers that further additional annexes are certainly possible as needs may arise, and that making those additions will be easier than revising the entire document again, well, until such a revision is absolutely necessary. Part 1 identifies the ASB document deliverables. Some of you may participate in or have participated in the work of other standards developing organizations. If you do or have, you will be familiar with the fact that each SDO has unique phraseology and terminology. Under ANSI's essential requirements, accredited U.S. SDOs use different types of deliverables to accommodate the needs of their constituencies. Excuse me. Many U.S. standards organizations do not have guides or guidelines. But here at ASB, we have paid attention to you and believe that the introduction of this new document type provides an additional choice that you've asked for. For example, comments, especially public comments or consensus discussion, may cause you to discover or consider that what started out to be a standard has content that is really not ready yet for standardization. In that case, you might decide the better way to characterize the content is as a guideline. Keep in mind, it is entirely your choice. Before diving into the document descriptions, though, let's take a look at how documents flow through ASB. You know better than I do that the potential for ASB document development can start as a draft that comes in from outside, or it could start inside as well. For example, a professional forensic organization, a state forensic laboratory, an individual, and certainly our colleagues at OSAC can submit a new work proposal, or NWP, for consideration by an ASB consensus body. At this point, you all review the proposed work and consider a number of elements, including, do you want to work on it? And yes, that is actually your choice. Do you agree with the title, the proposed scope, the proposed need? And do you agree with the document type proposed? Before submitting the NWP for board approval, you do have the option to rewrite what comes into ASB based on your own deliberations. These are all your decisions to make. This is extremely important and critical to the ultimate success of ASB documents. At the very heart of ANSI accredited work, along with the openness, transparency, and due process, is consensus. In an open consensus process, every aspect of a document is subject to discussion and determination of agreement. For forensic documents, that even includes the science. Nothing is sacred except the rule of consensus itself. That's why having document choice is an advantage. Something may start out as a standard, and in the discussions, agreements, disagreements, fights, concessions, you, the CB writers, determine if the issue in question is actually ready for standardization. All right, let's take a look at what ASB calls a standard. The definition is very close to the one used by ISO. The essential nature of a standard is to establish requirements, and the essential nature of a requirement is that it can be measured or assessed. Please note that the document itself is a standard. It does not contain standards. It establishes requirements. The word standard has many meanings outside of this standardization world, but inside here, it is a type of document. The purpose of a standard is to reflect a level of agreement on the content, whether it's science, process, materials, activities, you name it. Measurability of requirements might be expressed as methodologies, dimensions, operational procedures, and so forth. So, what kind of language establishes requirements? Well, there are two ways. First, use imperative language, like I just did. Secondly, tell the reader what he or she shall do, as in CBs shall read the manual. The new ASB guideline, what is it? Well, think of a guideline as something that gives advice on how to read, understand, or interpret the actions or processes, usually in a standard or even in a best practice recommendation. Put another way, a guideline aids in the application of principles practices and activities. The key characteristic is that a guideline is assistance in understanding and implementing actions, but does not standardize on them and does not establish best practice recommendations. The guideline document is an advantage when some activities are really not yet ready to be standardized and not well used enough to be best practices. And yet, the activities benefit from advice or implementation guidance. It may take a while for you to figure out what you want to do with this document, when you need it, what kind of approach. That's perfectly fine. Guidelines don't use imperatives or shall language. They are informative and use should or may or can. By itself, a guideline is not suitable for conformity assessment since it does not establish requirements. Although, depending on what an organization wants, it can certainly become a required document for that organization, and as such, they may wish to include it in their own assessment process. Before moving on to the rest of what is in Part 1, it's important to note that ASB staff, management, and the board realize that the introduction of a new document type is going to generate a lot of questions. We actually hope it does. That will be the best way to refine the understanding of how to use this tool. And that's exactly what it's intended to be, a useful tool so that you, as the content writers, have options for developing material. At a minimum, and not attempting to assume, much less answer, all the questions, consider together the following. First, the new document type is ready for your immediate use as you see fit. There will be more information and guidance to help you in your choice. ASB will be reviewing procedures to determine where, if at all, they need to be amended or edited to accommodate the new document type. We'll certainly let you know if that occurs. Some of the questions we anticipate include the impact of guidelines on the user community of ASB documents, or on whether or how this new type of document impacts existing documents and those in the pipeline and during the 5-year review. The best way to respond at this point is to say that there is no immediate impact on published ASB and ANS documents. Documents in the pipeline are at a different stage, as you know, and if you, as a CB writer, decide that you would like to change the work on one from, well, let's say, a standard to a guideline, that's your choice. Similarly, in the required 5-year process, you may decide that an existing published document needs to be revised. Making these determinations will require many considerations, and we're here to help you in that process. For example, in the 5-year review process, you might find that a guideline now contains content that you feel is completely ready for standardization. So you review and you decide you're going to go from a guideline to a standard. It could be the other way around as well. Absolute rules, well, they're the same as always. Follow the ANSI essential requirements, and we at staff are ready to help in that at any time. Maintain a rigorous consensus process and follow the ASB procedures. Really, that's it. Most importantly, we will continue to listen to your needs, so tell us what you have to say, ask your questions, and provide comments. You are the document writers. Best practice recommendations. Many of you are already used to this terminology. Best practices are just that, identification of the optimal manner in which to carry out an action or activity. Typically, a BPR will offer the best choices among those that are possibly available. A BPR is useful for providing practical information on how to select the best way to do things, such as preferred technical processes or optimal variations in procedures that have not been spelled out in a standard. A BPR does not establish requirements, but it does recommend the best way to achieve standardized actions. Because BPRs do not set new measurable requirements, the language is informative, should language, and often is followed by examples and explanations. BPRs can accompany standards and guidelines for making a complete package of requirements information. Doing that is entirely up to you, the CB document volunteers and writers. Of course, the basics apply, meaning that throughout all of this, ASB adheres to the ANSI essential requirements, and consensus is the key. Technical report is very simple. It's an explanatory information-only document. A technical report informs the reader on any of a wide variety of topics related to a field of activity, a profession, a large topical area. Emerging technologies are often the subject matter. Research findings or background materials relevant to a specific area of interest, such as forensic discipline. All of that might become grist for the TR mill. While it's not common, TRs can also be used as the terms and definition documents that accompany a whole series of documents, where those documents may simply refer to the TR in their own terms and definition sections. The advantage is simply that you do not have to repeat the terms and definitions that are common throughout that series of documents. Of course, there's really no prescribed language for a TR. The language is subject to what is appropriate for the content. The only thing that TRs do not do is they don't establish requirements or recommendations in a manner that leads to any kind of conformity assessment. They are information documents only. So the takeaways here: you, the consensus body writers, are in control of what gets written, and the new manual is organized to better equip you for doing that. Yes, it's entirely possible that more than one document type could be considered during the development process. Discussion and consensus will ultimately make the decision. Can mistakes be made? Well, depends on what you call a mistake. If, as a consensus body, you decide that a document is a standard and it's published, but then it turns out the content is not really ready for standardization, it generally will mean that a document isn't going to be used. And then I contend it's not a mistake in process, but one simply where information was lacking. Process and procedural errors can and do occur, but that's where ASB's staff and I are ready to correct them or help you correct them. The holy grail of document development is consensus, so I highly recommend that you focus on that. Now, let's finish up part 1 material. Document identifiers may seem trivial, but that would be something akin to believing URLs are trivial. Identifiers are critical to records keeping and helping prevent copyright infringement, and that is very, very important for a standards developing organization and its users. Title is probably the most expected identifier. In the public process review stage, the title and the next identifier, scope, are the easiest ways for potential users and other SDOs to understand what the document intends to convey. It's important that the title and scope accurately portray the content of the document. When an ASB document is downloaded and opened, we all want the user to not be surprised. For example, if a document would be titled, and here I'm making this up, Standard Methods for Determining Chromium +3 Levels in a Matrix of Cow's Milk, and the user finds out that the document only addresses lead levels in goat milk, that user is not only surprised, but possibly seriously disappointed in ASB, and we all want to avoid that. Writing a good scope is not always easy, as many of you know, and ASB staff, including myself, will not hesitate to send a scope statement back for tweaking. The trick, if you will, is to say what is in the document, what the content will do, and, if appropriate, what it will not do or will not cover. And all of this without getting into need or background. There's a bit more about scope writing later in this presentation. This manual adds a new annex, Annex D, devoted to scopes and how to write them, and includes examples we hope will be useful for you. In terms of publication number, it's a no-brainer if ASB is to keep accurate records. So, writing style is one of the newer elements, and this revision emphasizes the need for plain English. ASB is interested in publishing documents that are expressed clearly, that say things in the best possible way, so that users understand them, and so that implementing a document is not foiled by twisted phraseology. Generally, but not exclusively, the requirements in this section follow those advocated by the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO. Now, part 2 has to do with formatting. A lot of this is going to be familiar to many of you because not much has changed from the 2018 version or even the 2016 version. These elements are still required: cover page, title page, foreword. I will note that the required language for the foreword in one area has changed. Section 1 of ASB documents is still scope. Section 2 is still normative references. 3 is still terms and definitions. All 3 of these sections, though, have additional modifications that will be seen in new annex section, and we'll also go over some of them in this presentation. Right now, I'd like to draw your attention to Section 4, which is where you, as the document writers, place the significant content of a document. Here, the manual is organized quite differently than in previous versions in regard to how the section applies to each of the document types. The next 3 slides will demonstrate the changes. Please note that, as before, if a document covers more than one major significant topical area, where applicable, you can include additional sections like Section 5 or 6 or 7. The manual separates out the rules for how to develop Section 4. I'm going to go back here. Guidelines and standards, BPRs, guidelines. Shown here are the rules for Section 4 of a standard. Note that the rules really refer to the phrasing and terminology used in the section. For example, since this is a standard, Section 4 is characterized by requirements, and those requirements use shall language or imperative directions. Note how the issue of conformance is stated here. While Section 4 only includes requirements that can be confirmed or assessed, it doesn't specify the kind of validation. That specification is optional. And in fact, any references to conformity assessment do have to follow ANSI's essential requirement rules, which are found in Annex C of the manual. Also note that recommendations can be sparingly included, but only when necessary to clarify a point for implementation. In fact, where there is a need to include recommendations for implementations, you can do that either by including an informative annex or by developing an accompanying guideline. Recommendations for BPRs, for BPRs or guidelines. ASB urges CBs to write recommendations as declarative sentences to the extent possible. Recommendations don't use shall language. While it's tempting to give negative directions to a user, we also ask you to the best extent possible to avoid writing not statements, such as you shall not do this. This shall not be done. Absolutely do not write in this section a whole treatise or a research paper or a long history. If for any reason such lengthy material you feel is necessary, include it in an informative annex. Better yet, you might even think about it in terms of developing a technical report. Technical content and language of a technical report is appropriate to the subject. TRs don't establish requirements. A TR is not intended to provide recommendations in the sense of a guideline or a BPR. Of course, depending on what the technical report is about, let's say a research report or a study findings, the material itself might contain recommendations in context, but the technical report is not setting out to establish recommendations. Part 2 also includes other common and less common components of documents, and the new annexes address these. Now, as you rush to dive into the annex part, please note that ASB staff and myself are here to help the application of the manual, including its annexes. Even the best textbook will never address all the possible variations in application and the questions that are generated by those variances. The next slide shows the list of annexes, and then we'll take a closer look at 2 of them. As of now, there are 9 annexes. As document writers, you may need additional insight in some areas that are not yet covered in the manual. As previously mentioned, if and when more annexes are desired or needed, they can be added without having to reissue an entire new edition of the manual. Questions and references do come up with some regularity. Annex F on references and notes is intended to help in answering those types of questions. We hope explanations in the manual, and especially in this annex, will help reduce, if not eliminate, any confusion. Here are the 2 things that you really need to understand and adhere to in your work as consensus body writers. The first is that all references shall be, must be, have to be published and available before a document goes out the ASB door for any reason, period. Doing otherwise is a violation of openness and transparency. For example, it doesn't matter if a document goes for public review on Monday, knowing that the unpublished reference would be published on Tuesday. Unfortunately, no. Both documents have to wait for Tuesday. The second important element here is the rather infamous issue of what does normative versus informative mean? Well, here's the answer. If a document cannot be implemented in whole or in part without a given reference, then the reference is normative. In other words, the reference is indispensable. I know this can be tricky sometimes in a consensus process because some might understand that word normative to be a quality adjective like swell or best of the best or really, really super good. That's not the case, however. Without judging the reference itself, the issue isn't the reference, but whether or not it is indispensable to the proper use of the document. Sometimes the matter can require considerable discussion in order to reach understanding and consensus. And it has been stated a number of times before, staff, we are here to help you with interpretation if and when you ask for it. Next, let's take a look at Annex D on scope statements. The first key element to note is that scope statements only include statements of fact. The reason is consistent with the purpose of a scope, and the annex references the ISO directive because we think it says it pretty well. The scope clearly defines the subject of the document and the aspects covered, thereby indicating the limits of applicability of the document or parts thereof. And then it goes on to say that if there are something that might be reasonably inferred to be covered by the document but isn't, the scope ought to say that as well. This explains what a scope statement says and does, but it can also be important to tell a potential user what it doesn't contain. Are there some kinds of information that are excluded from scopes? Yes. Certain requirements, recommendations, background information, statements of justification, certainly not emotional diatribes. We haven't seen emotional diatribes, at least up to this point, but we have seen a number of scopes that contain requirements, contain a lot of justification or background information. Justifications are really something that can be expressed nicely in the need statement or even in the forward statement, but they don't belong in the scope. We hope this annex, and it's got more examples, will be helpful to you. All right, let's take a brief look at the new ASB supplemental guide, which contains the ASB sample document showing the detailed formatting instructions and includes the new document templates. You probably will recognize the fact that the ASB sample document used to be contained within the manual itself, and what we did is we separated out. So we did that because we thought it made it easier to use as a quick formatting guide and to facilitate the completion of documents. In any standards organization, the formatting and style is indicative of the organization's brand. It needs to be consistent across all documents. All required elements from Part 2 of this manual are included and formatted with respect to font size, placement on the page, spacing, and so forth. But also included is a new fill-in document template we'll see in a moment. This is a demonstration of how the ASB sample document is prepared by the guide. It's really exactly what you have seen in the 2018 version. By and large, it really has not changed. But let's take a look at the new innovation in the guide, which is a pre-formatted fill-in template. This is for all document styles. So, someone wishes to submit a draft document for ASB's consideration, they can use this template and fill in the blue areas with their own language. Completely fill it out and attach the ASB new work proposal that follows, and then submit their work. All of the work of formatting, font size, font type, where it's placed in the document, spacing, that's all part of the pre-formatting. So, you're all probably familiar with the new work proposal form, I'm sure. If ASB needs to revise this, I know staff is looking to see if this has to be revised. You'll certainly know, obviously. That would be something that you would learn from us, and it will replace this one at the appropriate time in the manual. So as a summary, the major changes in the new manual are improved organization, the introduction of a new deliverable, and emphasis on plain English, plus a separate sample document with pre-formatted slides, templates. Up and coming, well, here are some ideas that are already in construction and being considered, upcoming modules. What's really important, however, is you tell us, what do you need? What would be helpful? This is all being done to help you, to help make your job easier, to ease confusion, to make you happier, really. So tell us what you would like, and we'd be happy to accommodate. So thank you all for listening. I hope that you have found this to be informative. And after the next slide, we'll go into the live Q&A session with Teresa and Linda.